When Acura first launched the MDX, a lot of folks scoffed, but then soon after, manufacturers began to sit up and take notice. Because while the MDX was launched into a world full of body-on-frame SUVs, the MDX promised to be more efficient, easier to park, better to drive, and have a more usable third row. Over the years that followed, the MDX not only became Acura's best-selling vehicle in the United States, it also became the best-selling three-row luxury vehicle in this country. So it's easy to see that Acura didn't want to screw things up with the 2022 MDX, so they really didn't depart too much from the formula that's made this model a success, even though this is almost an entirely new vehicle. Really, the only thing that's shared with the outgoing MDX are portions of the engine under the hood. The design of this MDX is definitely bolder, sharper, and boxier than the previous generation model, but still instantly recognizable as an Acura, of course, even excluding this enormous Acura logo right here in the middle of this grille. The grille itself has some diamond elements that radiate outwards, which is kind of an attractive look, and then we have these really cool slim LED headlights on each side. These are standard, so you don't have to worry about getting an upper-level trim to get the snazzier headlights that we see in this particular model, although you will have to work your way up the trim ladder in order to get the LED fog lights. As we move around to the side, you'll definitely notice the boxier proportion versus the previous model. The front end is certainly more vertical. One thing I found interesting is that under the headlights, which wrap around the side there, as you can see, we have what looks like an intake grate, but it actually is fake. It does nothing. Acura said that in their wind tunnel tests, it was actually better to have that completely sealed off. Full disclosure before we move on, I've only had my hands on this MDX for 24 hours, and Acura dropped this off right in the middle of an epic windstorm here in Northern California. There are trees down everywhere, and I have literally been trapped at home for about 12 hours because of trees down on the roads near me. So I haven't been able to give this as thorough a test as I would like, and this is an early production model of the MDX. So by the time this goes into full production and I get my hands on one for a complete week, things may change in this video, most notably in the drive section where I have not had as much time as I would like to put this through its paces out on the road. But back to the regular review here. This is 198.4 inches long. That's about 2 inches longer than the outgoing MDX. Some of that goes to the inside, and some of it goes to give this a slightly more rear-wheel drive proportion than we've seen in the MDX before. But Acura did not go quite as far as Volvo did by really stretching the dash-to-axle ratio out like we see in the XC90. So we still have a pretty decent front overhang and proportions that are boxier and more upright, but not necessarily rear-wheel drive in nature. So this is going to look a little bit different than the GLE or the BMW X5, but quite similar to its more direct competition. In terms of length, this is almost identical to the Cadillac XT6, a key competitor. This is 1 inch shorter than the Audi Q7, also a very direct competitor, an important 4 inches longer than the Volvo XC90, and you will notice that on the inside, and a whopping 6 inches longer than arguably the MDX's classic and best competitor, the Lexus RX. Now, Lexus does have a three-row RX, the RXL, but let's be honest, the third row in that RXL is next to useless, and the MDX has always had quite a usable third row. Now, this third row is not as large as you'd find in a bigger SUV, something like a Lincoln Navigator or some of those larger luxury SUVs out there, but it is still much more usable than the one that we find in that Lexus RX. From this angle, you can see that the rear of the MDX continues to have a more raked profile than we find in something like the Infiniti QX60. That gives us a little bit less third row practicality and a little bit less cargo practicality than we find in the QX60, but it helps keep this from looking like a blown-up minivan. The clean and elegant design language of this MDX is certainly a lot less controversial than what we see in the Lexus RX. We have full LED tail lamp modules back here, including amber turn signals. That's really a nice touch. And then we have dual exhaust tips down at the bottom of the bumper, and they are real exhaust tips. They're not faux ones tacked onto the rear like we find in a lot of modern Audis. This particular model does have front and rear parking sensors. As we see in the rest of the Acura lineup, the MDX is full of standard active driver assistance features like radar adaptive cruise control with their aggressive lane centering system, autonomous braking, and of course this model has everything available on the MDX, including blind spot monitoring, front and rear parking sensors, and the available 360-degree camera system. Although this is slowly changing with the European competition, generally speaking, you're going to find more active driver assistance tech standard on the Acura or the Lexus competitor than you will the average European entry, because it's only been recently that even safety-obsessed brands like Volvo have started to include more and more active safety technologies standard on every trim. When the MDX goes on sale in February of 2021, there will be just one engine under the hood. It's basically the same 3.5-liter V6 engine that we found under the previous generation MDX. Under this hood, it produces 290 horsepower and 267 pound-feet of torque. One thing I found odd, however, is that this engine is tuned for 91 octane gasoline according to Acura, but you do find related 3.5-liter V6s in Honda products rated for regular unleaded that don't produce too much less power. So I really wish that Honda had either bumped the power up a little bit or just tuned this for regular unleaded so people could save a few dollars at the pump. This is now mated to a new 10-speed automatic transmission, not the ZF 9-speed that we found in the last generation MDX. And for a lot of folks out there, that's going to be a pretty big deal, because this 10-speed automatic is considerably smoother than the old 9-speed. It also shifts a lot faster. This is one of my favorite transmissions on sale in North America right now, and thankfully all MDX models will get it. Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system remains optional, so base models are going to be front-wheel drive. You can add on super handling all-wheel drive for a 1 mile per gallon penalty. This system has also been tweaked for 2022. It can now send power to the rear axle over a broader range of different driving circumstances. Up to 70% of engine power can be sent to the rear axle, and then 100% of that 70% can be sent to a single rear wheel. If you're looking for more power and more fun out of your next MDX, don't worry, they have you covered. Later in 2021, there will be an MDX Type S. The Type S name has been confirmed, as has the engine. It's going to be a 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder engine borrowed from the TLX Type S. Under this hood, it should produce about 355 horsepower and 354 pound-feet of torque, although those power numbers are not quite firm yet. It's going to be mated to the same 10-speed automatic transmission and Acura super handling all-wheel drive system that we find in this model, only obviously producing an awful lot more power. The first thing you're likely to notice when you get inside the MDX is the front seats. These are very comfortable. I'm going to give these 9 out of 10 points because I do find the seats in the BMW X5 just a little bit more comfortable in top-end trims. These are going to feature available massage at some point later, but Acura has not been horribly specific about that date, and this particular model does not have that feature yet. However, we do have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support, power extending thigh cushion, inflatable bolsters, and we have a 3-position memory over there on the door rather than a 2-position memory like we see in some Lexus models. We also have a powered tilt telescopic steering column, and unlike many Lexus models, a front passenger seat that has the same range of motion as the driver's seat. So if you're frequently going somewhere with your spouse or your significant other and they're upset that the front seat on the passenger side doesn't have an extending thigh cushion or 4-way lumbar for those longer road journeys, you may want to take a look at the MDX because this will have that feature. Jumping into the second row, I think that the first thing you're going to notice is that the back doors don't open quite as wide as some of the competition. That means it could be a little bit trickier to get child seats in and out of the back of the MDX. At least for the moment, all trims will have a standard moonroof. So if you're doing headroom comparisons between the MDX and the competition, keep that in mind if the competitor has an optional moonroof. The second row seats slide forward and backward, but interestingly enough, just the 2 outboard sides, and that's because this center seat is removable. All MDX models for 2022 will be 7-seat vehicles, 2 up front, 3 in the middle, and then 2 in the way back. But if you prefer a bit more of a captain's chair vibe, this center seat can be removed. We simply pull a little bit of webbing here. We can fold it down and use it like an armrest with 2 cup holders there, or I can pull another piece of webbing up front and then completely remove the center seat. This is a trick that we've seen in minivans before, but so far not in a luxury crossover. If you remove this position, then it is going to give you a bit more of a captain's chair vibe. It would be really interesting to see if the aftermarket gives us things like a replaceable center console or something like that you could snap into that same area, because if you do remove this, then the outboard seats don't have center armrests. The removable middle seat is really an innovative feature. This seat is also relatively light. It weighs about 30 pounds. This is a little bit lighter than some of the minivan removable center seats that I've seen out there. It means that most adults should have no problem removing this from the vehicle safely themselves, and kids will probably be able to do it if they have a little bit of help. When it comes to child seat accommodations, the MDX has become wider, especially across the second row. That's really noticeable when you take a look at that center seat position. This means it's going to be a lot easier to accommodate some of those larger child seats or 3 child seats, because we do have 3 sets of latch anchors right here in the second row. That center seat does not share latch anchors with the outboard seating positions. It has its very own, and all 3 seat positions have top tether anchors as well. Although it's definitely not my preference, the seat belt for that center position comes out of the ceiling, but Acura has done a good job of not having a huge bump. It actually is pretty flush with the rest of that ceiling panel. There are a few ways to get into the mother-in-law row. I could just fold these second row seats forward right like that in their cargo position and hop over. There's also a power button to tilt and slide them forward, or of course you could remove that center seat position and then have an aisle to get into the third row. The first thing you'll notice back here is that the third row seat is definitely more comfortable than the previous generation MDX. They've raised the seat bottom cushion off the ground by about 2 inches. That means that adults and older children are certainly going to have a bit more thigh support than before. We also have more combined legroom in here than we had in the previous model. At just over 109 inches, that puts this right in line with the XC90, the XT6, and the Audi Q7, some very, very direct competitors, although none of them are going to offer this removable center seat position. One interesting thing, this does not slide forward and backward, the center seat. So if this is Back in position, for instance, you cannot adjust how much legroom you want to give the second row and the third row right here in the middle. Third row headroom is pretty middle of the pack. This is a little bit better than the Q7 or the XC90, but I still have to crane my head to one side in order to actually put my head back there to the headrest. If I try and sit in a more natural upright position, the back of my head is certainly touching the ceiling right there, although I could logically do this for 20-30 minutes for a trip to lunch. Since this row is most likely going to be used for children or your mother-in-law, a more important consideration is the fact that we don't get any air vents back here. Even though the MDX has this raked rear window and definitely a raked profile in general out back, cargo capacity is still pretty decent at 18.1 cubic feet. That's certainly an improvement over the outgoing MDX. And when I first saw those numbers, I was a little bit surprised and some eyebrows were raised. I thought surely this cargo area would actually be a little bit smaller in person than what we see in the Cadillac XT6, but that is actually not the case. My friend Sofian from Redline Reviews actually has an XT6 this week. We measured them both, compared notes, compared pictures, etc. This cargo area is definitely bigger than the one that we find in the XT6, both in terms of length between the seat backs and the cargo opening, and also between this cargo opening and the backs of the front seats. Obviously, this is not as large as some of those larger three-row crossovers out there, so if you do plan on carrying 6 or 7 people and a ton of luggage, you're going to want to upgrade into something like a full-size SUV, but cargo practicality and the mixture of third-row practicality has long been an MDX strong suit, and that certainly continues for 2022. The MDX does not offer power folding third row seats. If that's something that you're looking for, you will need to look somewhere else. But to be perfectly honest, this is not a problem for me because the manual mechanisms not only give us more available cargo room, that power folding mechanism would take away some of the cargo space, especially the cargo space that we find right here under the load floor, but also manual seats move an awful lot faster. And these are pretty light, so it's really no problem at all to lift them back into place. That's one of the reasons that even in the luxury segment, not all of the options have power folding third row seats because, perfectly honestly, I would rather have the manual seat. In the Alex Nautilus exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, this area scores 9 out of 10 points. I love the fact that this underfloor storage area is wide enough to accommodate a 22-inch roller bag, and if it was skinny enough, you could even close the load floor on top of it. In case you're wondering, there is a spare tire. It's completely under the floor in the MDX. We have a 12-volt power outlet there, an optional roller shade cover for the cargo area, and a really interesting feature, which is the button opposite me. It's a proximity-based delay for the hatch. If you're grabbing something big out of the back and you'll have your hands full and you don't have any way to touch the button right up there on the hatch, you simply press this button, throw the key off into the distance, and then the hatch will close. In case you're wondering, the model that we're taking a look at today is the top-end advanced trim, so obviously keep that in mind as we take a look around the interior. But as I said before, all models will have a standard moonroof. As you can see, this is a very large panoramic moonroof, and it goes to just over the second row passengers' heads. Acura is very proud to say that this is the most premium and luxurious interior that they've ever crafted, and that is certainly true. You can see we have accent lighting back there on the rear door, integrated sunshades in the second row, 4-way adjustable front headrests, height adjustable shoulder belts as well. This model has the top-end leather upholstery with a lot of contrasting piping, as you can see going down that seat back. One thing that I found a little bit surprising with the premium mission is that the cover to the front seat back is actually a hard plastic right back there. Now, there is a practical reason for this. If you have kids and they're putting their feet up on that rear seat back, that is going to last an awful lot longer than a vinyl or a leather wrap to the rear seat back, but it may not feel quite as premium as some of the European options. Acura gives the perforations on the seat back and bottom cushion a bit of a different vibe than we typically see to help dress it up a bit. We also have that power extending thigh cushion and the power inflatable bolsters that I mentioned earlier on the passenger seat. With this generation of the MDX, Acura certainly decided to elevate the interior. We have much more premium materials and finishes in here than we found in the previous generation MDX. There's a lot of real wood trim going on the door there, those 3-position seat memory controls for the passenger seat, and a lot of stitched goods and premium materials on that door entirely. Another really nice touch is the ambient lighting in this cabin. You can see that we have 2 different colors going on here, one above that wood section and then one above this black plastic insert and below the wood trim on the doors. This is highly configurable via the infotainment system. There are a ton of different themes to choose from, some that have just one color and some that use this 2-color theme. As we move on over to the dashboard, we find a lot of stitched leather, a lot of stitched goods going on here. That black plastic strip again, and then above that we have an insert of real wood trim. With the colors and the lighting in this vehicle, it's a little bit difficult to highlight that wood, but it is open pore wood trim. Moving to the middle of the dashboard, we have the same widescreen infotainment software that we see in other Acura models, but on a new and much larger screen. Acura is one of the few companies that allows you to connect your smartphone either wirelessly or wired. It's your choice. Other than that, the software is essentially the same as the software that we find in the TLX and the RDX. The most important thing to keep in mind is that this is not a touchscreen. The only way to control this infotainment system is with the touchpad in the center of the dashboard. Working our way down the dashboard, we have that engine start-stop button there, the controls for the tri-zone automatic climate control. You can see the front 2 zones and then the rear zone right there. Below this, we have the controls for the heated and ventilated seats, a large knob for the shift mode. The large knob in the center is the drive mode selector. You rotate it around for sport, individual, custom, comfort, etc. We then have Acura's Hunt and Peck style shifter here, park, reverse, neutral, drive, and then sport there. Under door number 1, we find some USB charge ports. It's kind of an interesting way to hide them away. We then have an auto start stop disable button, auto brake hold, the controller for that infotainment system. This is a little bit different than the controller that we see in the Lexus models. If you want to know more about this, I have a video just on Acura's infotainment system. Power and volume knob right there, and then track forward backward. A very small storage cubby there. 2 very large cup holders, and then an enormous wireless charging mat. I love the fact that this is huge because smartphones seem to be getting bigger and bigger, and you could probably fit a small tablet right there. This is just an armrest for that infotainment controller. We then have a softly padded center armrest. It opens in 2 steps. We have one so you can access that entire area right there, one USB input for the infotainment system, and a power outlet. And then I can lower this and then get a little divider where I could put pens, pencils, and smaller items as well. As with a number of other Acura models, there's a windshield projected heads-up display available. Perhaps the biggest news in here is that this is the first Acura to get a full LCD instrument cluster. All the other models have had a small LCD with some physical gauges surrounding them. This display is not as configurable as some of the modern Mercedes and Audi displays, but it still changes based on the drive mode. So this is the normal mode. We have a tachometer over here on the left. If I engage comfort, we get some blue accents, and then that disappears. If I move over to the sport mode, you can see that we have a power monitor with 0 and basically 100% power up there at top, tachometer, and then a speedometer over here on the right in addition to the digital speedometer. And then the individual gauge is basically the same look as the normal mode. You can also adjust what you see over here on the right side of the LCD by rotating a knob on the steering wheel. We have a bunch of different displays there. This is also where we would adjust certain vehicle safety settings. So if I pressed the safety mode button, you can actually adjust some of those settings right here. You can also opt for a more conventional looking dial theme. That's what sport, normal, and comfort mode look like there. The steering wheel is pretty similar to what we see in the TLX. We have paddle shifters on the back. It's a round design with a split bottom spoke. The buttons for the adaptive cruise control system are over here on the right side. This knob arrangement controls that multifunction LCD cluster. Then we have some infotainment buttons over here on the left. If you're wondering how to access the 360-degree camera system, that took a moment for me to figure out myself, but once I did, I have to say this is one of the better solutions for this problem. There's a camera button right here at the end of the windshield wiper stalk, rather than the turn signal stalk. So very easy press of a button right here. It just turns on that 360-degree camera system with the forward view. Obviously, it will automatically turn it on with the backup view when you're in reverse. Bearing in mind that the scores you're going to see on your screen are preliminary scores for the MDX, in my initial 0 to 60 testing, this model ran 0 to 60 in 7 seconds even. That was a little bit slower than I had expected because that's a little slower than the outgoing MDX, even though this new 10-speed automatic transmission has a slightly lower first gear. The likely reason for that is that this is heavier than the outgoing MDX. Depending on the exact version that you're looking at, this is a few hundred pounds heavier. If you're looking for the fastest MDX available, you might want to scour dealer lots because that would be the MDX Sport Hybrid at the moment, although logically, the Type S is going to be considerably faster than the model that I'm driving today. Even though this model is heavier than the outgoing MDX, Acura has hid the weight increase very well. In our 60-0 stopping test, this model took only 109 feet to stop. That is a very, very good stopping distance for a vehicle this large. Bear in mind that we have wide tires. 255 width tires are standard on all MDX models at the moment. It looks like the Type S is probably also going to get 255 width tires, although some of those details are a little bit unclear at the moment. I was actually surprised that the Type S model wouldn't get slightly wider tires because we do find wider tires available in something like the XC90. But the XC90 does not have a torque vectoring axle like we find in the MDX, and that makes this a ton of fun out on your favorite winding mountain road, because we get rear end rotation that you just don't find in something like that Volvo. This feels a little bit more like the BMW X5, and to be honest, driving this back to back with the X5, comparably priced of course, this actually feels a little bit more fun when you're really pushing it harder in the corners because of that torque vectoring axle. You don't find that in the less expensive forms of the X5. This really has a great power on feel to it. Now, power off, it still is going to feel a little bit front heavy. That's something that we've seen in Acuras with super handling all-wheel drive before. but that just means that you need to put your foot down a little bit harder. When it comes to handling, I'm absolutely going to give this an A. This is not going to drive like some of the rear-wheel drive competition, but it's an awful lot closer than you might think. I should take a moment to talk about super handling all-wheel drive, because some folks do get a little bit confused about this. This is still a transverse, transaxle, and engine setup up front, so very similar to what we find in the regular front-wheel drive MDX. But things happen a little bit differently when we start talking about the rear axle and the power transfer unit to the rear versus something like the XC90. Because with super handling all-wheel drive, the rear axle is actually driven slightly faster than the front, and that's not what we see in the Volvo. So in the Volvo, although theoretically you could send nearly 100% of engine power to the rear if the front was slipping, this vehicle doesn't need the front to slip in order to send more than 50% of engine power to the rear. It simply connects that coupling, and because the rear is overdriven, you've effectively sent more oomph to the rear. Depending on the circumstance, the yaw angle, the accelerator position, etc., up to 70% of engine power can be sent to the rear axle. The disclaimer here is that it is situation dependent. This vehicle will not always send 70% of engine power to the rear axle. It just is capable of doing that over a broad range of different driving situations. The more important thing, though, is that this vehicle can send 70% of engine power and torque to a single rear wheel. And that's why when you start going around these corners full throttle, it starts to rotate in a way that you'd expect out of a really well-sorted rear-wheel drive car. You'll really notice that in low-speed situations, if you're just pulling out of a parking lot, merging into traffic, or if you're really starting to flog this hard out on your favorite road. Out on a rougher road like the one that I'm on here, the MDX's adaptive suspension system seems to have a bit more polish than we find in the TLX. In the TLX, in the comfort mode, sometimes the suspension would bottom out on really rougher pavement, and that really surprised me. We don't find that same sort of feeling in the MDX here. Now, this is still tuned on the firmer side of this segment, so keep that in mind. If you're looking for something with a really cushy ride, you might want to get something like the Lexus RX, or of course, there are some of the European competition that have an available adaptive air suspension. Those could feel a little bit softer than this, but this is certainly acceptable for daily driving, and that's why I'm going to give the ride quality an A- here, just bearing in mind that there are some softer tuned options out there. If I put the vehicle into sport mode, the suspension certainly firms up, but it doesn't become as rock hard as something like a BMW X5M. That wasn't Acura's mission with this MDX. In my cabin noise testing, I measured 71 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour, making this pretty comparable with the Audi Q7 and the Volvo XC90, a little bit louder than the BMW X5. The last X5 that we tested was suspiciously quiet. It's honestly a little bit difficult to talk about fuel economy. I haven't been able to drive this on my usual fuel economy test loops, but over a day of mixed driving, I've been averaging about 18 miles per gallon. Now, again, that hasn't been on my usual fuel economy test loop, so I'm still going to give this a B, but that B is based just on the EPA ratings. Versus most of the European competition with similar performance numbers to this, you're going to get very similar fuel economy. You will, however, get much better fuel economy in some of the available hybrid and plug-in hybrid vehicles out there. Something like that Volvo XC90 plug-in hybrid is not only going to get you 0 to 60 considerably faster than this, it also is going to get about 27 mpg when driven relatively gently. But on the other hand, the XC90 is simply not going to have the dynamics that we find in this MDX. That T8 may be very powerful, but it has the odd combination of torque steer and a little bit of rear-wheel drive steer at the same time. It's just not going to feel like this. Definitely a lot more torque steer. This really doesn't have torque steer around the corners because so much more power is going to the rear axle. And there's no torque vectoring ability in that XC90. It quite simply is not going to be dynamic competition to this. If you want to be one of the first people out there to get your hands on the new MDX, you probably want to call your Acura dealer today because these should be on sale right around the time that you're watching this video. They are, however, going to be a little bit more dear than the last generation MDX, about $2,400 more for the base model, coming up to $46,900. If you want all-wheel drive, that's a $2,000 option on every trim level. Until Acura releases pricing information on the MDX Type S, this is going to be the most expensive version of the MDX you can get, the advanced package with super handling all-wheel drive. This one came in just over $60,000 before tax, title, license, and destination. You'll notice that's a much narrower price range than we find really in any of the direct competition. Some of that is because we don't have as many options yet in the MDX. Again, that Type S model is coming a little bit later. And the other reason is that Acura is bundling a lot of standard equipment, so there are just not as many option boxes that you need to check because so much is included standard. As with the previous generation MDX, This generation MDX is unquestionably a good value in the luxury segment. It offers a much more usable third row than the one that we find in the Genesis GV80. Remember that the GV80 really is a two-row vehicle. It's directly targeted at the two-row BMW X5 and the two-row Mercedes-Benz GLE. It's not really targeted at the MDX. This has a three-row in all forms. All versions of the MDX are going to be 7-seat vehicles. Just one trim level of the GV80 has a teeny tiny third row. Same thing basically going on in the BMW X5. You won't really find too many third rows out there, and in the upper end trims of X5, it's just not available at all. The reason is that BMW and Mercedes, of course, offer much larger three-row vehicles. So if you really wanted a more accommodating third row with room that's a little bit bigger than we find in the MDX, that's where the X7 and the GLS play, but they're going to be an awful lot more expensive than this. In many ways, the MDX's main competition is someone that's looking for a Lexus RX or an RXL and realizes, hey, I need a third row, and I need a third row that's actually usable. That's where the MDX is going to come in. Or someone that's looking at a Volvo XC90 or an Infiniti Q7, and perhaps they're looking for something that's going to be a little bit more reliable, is not turbocharged because of course this has a naturally aspirated V6 engine under the hood, and is generally speaking a little bit roomier and more comfortable on the inside. That's again where the Acura comes in. And of course, a better value as well. For 2021 and 2022, there are a ton of great luxury three-row crossovers out there, and at this moment, I would be pretty hard-pressed to choose between this and the Volvo XC90. There are some great pros and cons to both of these vehicles. The XC90 has a bit more power and pep in its T6 engine than we find under this hood. Slightly better 0 to 60 time. Of course, there is a plug-in hybrid version of the XC90 as well, with tax credits available. I do like the interior quality and the interior parts in the XC90 a little bit better. I think it's slightly more cohesive than what we find in this MDX. But those upper end trims of XC90 are certainly going to be more expensive than this model. And if we're simply comparing base to base, remember that the base model XC90 gets the T5 engine, it's less powerful, and gets slower 0 to 60 times than we find in this MDX. And no version of that XC90 is going to have the torque vectoring axle that we find in this, so this is generally speaking always going to be more fun. Let me know what you would pick if your money were on the line, and of course hit that subscribe button down at the bottom of your screen so you can be updated on all of our latest videos, including a full review of the new MDX coming up just as soon as I can get my hands on it, when I can actually drive it, when there's no hurricane force wind happening here in Northern California and the roads aren't closed. Hopefully that will be within the next month or so. I'll see all of you later.